Thank you very much. And hopefully you can hear me okay and see my slides okay. I'm aware everybody's come back after lunch, so hopefully I can provide you with some exciting updates about things going on in dementia research. I think it's a really exciting area that we're working in at the moment, and I look forward to updating you a little bit more. I'm aware that today's focus is around risk factors, diagnosis and treatments. And this morning you've heard about some population-based research about vascular risk factors, amongst other things. And after this, you will be hearing about new anti-amyloid drug developments. So I'm going to focus on some new developments around dementia research infrastructure in the UK. And as I said, especially some exciting developments around trials and biomarkers for dementia. So this slide is actually a little out of date now, if I'm honest. It's pulling in some headlines that have been in the news over the last couple of years. But to be really honest, sadly, it hasn't changed drastically. I think a lot of people who are in this meeting will be aware that we have struggled in terms of our throughput of clinical trials, particularly in dementia over the last few years. And there's been a huge focus in infrastructure and government about how we address this. The government launched its life sciences vision back in 2021, which was really about building on some of the research successes that we had during COVID, and using those as a template for how we could improve some of the health urgencies of our day, including dementia. They followed this up with a paper called The Future of UK Clinical Research Delivery, which really laid out an ambition to increase NHS research capacity across the UK. And then in 2022, we had the new Health and Care Act, which established our integrated care boards across England. And by doing so, that really embedded research in the NHS. So there was a comment made in a paper back in the Lancet in 2022 that said this was now on a statutory footing. So integrated care boards were now required to think about how they got research into the NHS more widely. And this is, as I said, on the backdrop of several years of us struggling across the UK in terms of research recruitment and trial delivery, so that over the 5 years up until 21-22, we saw a 44% drop in recruitment to industry clinical trials across the CRM portfolio. Less than 50% of industry trials recruited to their target. And overall, the number of industry clinical trials that we were doing per year in that period fell by 41%. And a really striking figure that came out in 2021 was that only 61 participants had been recruited to late phase dementia trials in England, which is a really striking figure. And as a result, the Alzheimer's Research UK in 2022 commented, we're really at a tipping point for progress in dementia research in this country. And the government set up a review through Lord O'Shaughnessy. Those results were published in May 2023. And the real take-home message was that clinical research was not being well prioritized in the NHS, and the value of participating was not being effectively communicated to patients. And the next slide really just demonstrates again the same period where you can sadly see across the different phases of clinical trials how we have slipped in terms of our rankings, in terms of the number of clinical trials that we do. Now, there has been some pickup on these numbers since 2021 as a result of some of the infrastructure changes to address these difficulties, but I think we've still got a long way to go. So overall, we're thinking at this point that trials do need to be possibly cheaper, certainly faster in their setup time, and that's something that is being looked at and addressed. Probably more efficient. So I started working in dementia research about 25 years ago. And at that point, one of the really vital things, I think, was that we used to follow people up in our memory clinics. So I used to see my patients on an annual basis. And that meant it gave me an opportunity to develop a relationship with them and engage them in research. And I think it is much harder now because we tend to, in a lot of services, just see people for a diagnosis, maybe one follow-up appointment. And I think it gets harder to engage the public. So we really need to start thinking outside the box as to how we will recruit people and offer research to as many people as possible, because I'm an absolute believer that this is one of the things we should be making an option for all patients. The other thing that we're realizing is that dementia research needs to be much more reflective of the general population, much more real world. There's so much that's going on in dementia research at the moment, but a lot of it is done in very selective populations. The typical people we tend to recruit to trials, so people that are very well educated, that are already very engaged in concepts of research, and that's not what our clinical populations look like. And it needs to be more embedded. And although this talk has a strong focus on the UK, I think we need to think beyond the UK and how do we partner with other countries and bits of infrastructure beyond our own country. So just to highlight a few key bits of infrastructure changes that have happened over the last few years. As a result of the life sciences vision, the government set up a number of missions, including something called the Dementia Mission. And this was really about pulling together these pieces of infrastructure to highlight what can we do in research to further better care for people with dementia and better treatment. And you may have seen that just a couple of months ago, as part of that same infrastructure change, something called the Dementia Trials Accelerator has also been set up. So those two bits of infrastructure are working very closely to try and further some of the things that we need to improve. Another network that already existed, an NIHR network called the Dementia Translational Research Collaboration, has also had some money put into it to develop a trials network. And then I'm sure most people at this meeting will be aware that the CRN, the Clinical Research Network, is being relaunched this year as the Research Delivery Network and is being reconfigured into new regional areas. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on Dementias Platform UK and the fact that we're going to be going for renewal for that bit of infrastructure in the next year. So I'm going to update you a little bit on what we're hoping and doing already, planning to do and hoping to doing already. So to come on to Dementias Platform UK. Dementias Platform UK has been around for about 8 or 9 years now. We're in our second wave of funding from the Medical Research Council with industry support as well. And it is really, again, about trying to bring bits of key infrastructure together to make dementia research more effective. We have 3 arms. We have a data portal, which is a really robust bit of infrastructure. And as a result, it already houses a huge amount of research data. So what it basically does is provide the research, the data infrastructure rather, for a lot of existing studies and cohorts. So you can see about 66 cohorts, about 4 million participants worth of data. In addition, because this has been a really successful bit of infrastructure, it's now supporting 4 other hubs around aligned topics. So things like traumatic brain injury and NMD. So in terms of keeping data safe and secure and having a good platform for access for that data, I think we're doing really well. The second arm of DP UK is the Trials Delivery Framework, which is the bit I'm going to talk to you about today. And then the third arm is our Experimental Medicine Incubator, which is really about working with those industry partners on what are the key areas of research that we should be focusing on. And then we have 3 key themes at the moment in our Experimental Medicine Incubator: synaptic health, vascular health, and neuroimmunology. So just to emphasize a little bit what that incubator is doing, it really looks at the mechanisms and methods that we need to improve for further drug development, and that includes repurposing drugs. And so it's often looking at really novel biomarkers, things like MEG. How do we look at early vascular lesions and use those as biomarkers for people that could be at risk of developing dementia? And novel things like looking at immunophenotyping in prodromal disease. So really kind of early stage work. And the whole point is that we recruit through our trial delivery framework for our trials, and then the data kind of feeds into our data portal so that you have this entirely self-sustaining bit of infrastructure that can support these trials. I've mentioned our data portal already houses an awful lot of data within it, and it has a platform so researchers can go on, access, analyze the data live on the platform. The other really important thing our data portal does is it allows us the opportunity to link data sets, particularly NHS data. So I won't go into the process here. This is not my specialist area, but basically there are ways of extracting some of the personal identifiable data from some of these data sets using linkage keys that can then allow researchers to access certain levels of PID, but not within the data set itself. And I think this really presents an opportunity for DP UK to do more further work with our trial delivery framework. So I'm going to come on to that now. This is the aspect of DP UK that I lead on. And the driver for this was to establish a national integrated trial delivery network, really utilizing a lot of lead-in data. So for those of you that work a lot in clinical trials, you know, one of the reasons why we do struggle to deliver trials is we see huge screen failure rates for lots of people we recruit to our trials. And there's a lot of reasons for this. In the past, we've certainly felt that we haven't been good enough at being able to characterize people that we bring into trials. So there's just too many variables between participants. And as a result, if we're, say, trying a new drug, part of the reason why we see variable results is because the patient varied too much, the participants vary too much. And the more we know about participants before we recruit them into trials, the more we can understand, are these the right people for the right trial, for the right treatment? And the other drive for this network was to create a group of centers and sites that could then go on and deliver these trials. So what have we been doing over the last 12 months? Well, we've grown quite rapidly within the trials delivery framework. We have really largely growing, well-characterized, healthy and preclinical registers, and I'll tell you a bit more about those in a minute. And at this point, we probably have the largest dementia-focused and diverse clinical network in the UK. And these are really sites that are very enthusiastic and very engaged about getting involved in more trials. And the other thing I'm going to tell you about today is that we're now looking to build on the existing recruitment that we've managed to some trials with new CSF and blood biomarker infrastructure that we've had recently funded. So talking about our healthy and preclinical registers, these are pulled from existing research cohorts across the UK, and you can see those listed here. So these are basically people who have signed up already to go into cohorts at some point. We're able to pull all of that data together into two registers. One is called the Clinical Studies Register, and one is called Great Minds. Because these cohorts have often collected data on people coming into their cohorts already, we're able to pull those in with the participants' consent into these registers. So as you can see here, it means for the Clinical Studies Register, we have almost 60,000 people within that register, and we have data on their health and cognition in really large numbers. And we also have a large number, 22,000, with genetic data or GWAS data. The Great Minds cohort is a bit more specific. So people sign up to have serial cognitive tests done annually in this register. And they also sign up to be contacted based on their potential risk of developing dementia. So again, really good cohort in terms of data we already have, including genetic data and something called actigraphy, where we're starting to send out sets that look at how useful is things like gait in order being able to identify people that may be at risk of developing dementia. So again, these registers have been running for quite a while, and we've got currently about 26 studies running across them. So I think these are proving very successful and are led by Ivan Koichov, you can see on the slide here, who's one of my colleagues in Oxford. What we've really focused on in the last couple of years is the development of our clinical network. So as I mentioned, this is not only about how we recruit people with clinical disease, but also how do we create a group of really well-engaged sites that want to get more involved in dementia research. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're now the biggest UK dementia trial network or focused dementia trial network in the UK, so that our sites mean we now cover a quarter of NHS trusts and about a quarter of GP practices. We started offering studies across our network, and we're building relationships with other bit of infrastructure in the UK, so things like joint dementia research, and we're looking at whether we could do some kind of joint sign-up across both of our groups. Another group that's called the Brain Health Coalition. Some of you may be aware that there are a number of brain health clinics that have started to be set up across the UK. These are really clinics that have been set up with research money, but on the whole are sitting within existing NHS memory clinics, but with a focus on how do we start to think about brain health and supporting brain health and not just diagnosing dementia. So a real focus on how do we identify earlier disease as efficiently as possible so that we can provide support for some of those risk factors. But also, as we do seem to be on the cusp now of having disease-modifying drugs for Alzheimer's disease, how are we going to be able to roll those out for our patients? We've also got relationships with bodies beyond the UK. So the Global Alzheimer's Platform is a network of trial sites in the US. The Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative supports a lot of international research around dementia. And there's a new body called the International Registry for Alzheimer's Disease and Other Dementias, or INRAD for short. And we're working with them so that as we're starting to set up a registry across our sites, can we align our data sets? So again, this comes back to how do we make research and recruitment more efficient? So overall, what our network tries to do is to provide access to those real world populations by having as broad a reach as possible with sites that frankly see people a day-to-day in memory clinics. And then through our data portal, potentially have the possibility of NHS data linkage. So we have all of that background information on people in terms of their risk factors for dementia, other comorbidities they may have, all those sorts of things that are going to be very, very useful in that case. This is a map of where our sites are now. So we have 52 sites across the UK, and then we've partnered up with NHS Research Scotland and their 14 sites north of the border. And then we've consciously gone out to start partnering with primary care networks now. So we have 2 primary care networks that we're working with. And this is because of one of the points I made earlier. I recognize as somebody who sits in a memory clinic on a regular basis that I don't see patients for very long anymore. I don't get to follow them up. And I will see them maybe once or twice, and then they go back into primary care. And, you know, I think those services are going to change, and I think those services will change partly as a result of the new drugs that may be coming online. And I think as a result, a lot of patients and the public will say, actually, we want services to change and hopefully have input into what they look like. But in the meantime, if we're going to be able to offer research to as large a group of people with memory disorders as possible, we may need to recruit them through primary care. So that's what we've done. We've gone out and created this really large UK-wide network and included primary care in it as well. Just wanted to touch a little bit on one of those other bits of infrastructure I mentioned, which is this thing called the DTRC Trials Network. So the DTRC was a group of academic sites, so sites across the UK that are largely based at university sites, already very research active. What NIHR has done is to put some resource into these sites now to create a trials network. So you're probably thinking, well, why do we need 2 trials networks? That's a good point. But this trials network, the DTRC, will have a focus on supporting early phase clinical trials. So these are the really complex trials where you need access to things like PET imaging and potentially phase 1 and phase 2 trials. And the plan is to start probably with 6 sites and then ultimately build this out to about 20 sites that will be self-sustaining through the types of trials that they do. But there is a recognition that not every site that gets involved in research can deliver these types of trials. And so this set of concentric circles tries to emphasize that you can see on the outside here, we've got TDF sites. On the next circle round, we've got TDF or CRN network sites, or DRN as it will be. And then in the center here, you've got the DDRC trials network. So the idea is that you would have sites potentially moving between these different circles as they develop certain expertise to deliver different types of trials. But the important thing is that we work really collaboratively across these networks. So coming back to the trials delivery framework, I just want to highlight a few of the projects that we're doing already. So we've just started a new project looking at the feasibility of doing CSF biomarker testing in mental health-based memory clinics. So again, for people who work in memory clinics that are on this call, you will be very, very aware that most of us do not have access to biomarkers like PET and CSF if we work in mental health-based memory clinics. However, as how we manage risk factors around dementia and the possibility of new drugs becomes even more important and even more real for our patients, I think we have to look at the feasibility of being able to offer these kind of biomarkers to our patients. I'm not suggesting that everyone that comes through a memory clinic needs a lumbar puncture, but sometimes we see people in clinics where we're not really clear what the cause of their memory problem is, and this could be really helpful. The other thing to bear in mind is that if we do have disease-modifying drugs for Alzheimer's disease licensed this year, which I think there's a distinct possibility, the requirement to have those drugs and the follow-up that will be needed to monitor for side effects will probably involve things like CSF and PET imaging. So NHS England, for instance, is looking at how we increase capacity both for CSF testing and PET across the UK. So we're hoping to feed into those plans. 4 of our TDF sites are involved in this project, but we're hoping to expand in the future. And it's really looking at the feasibility of how do we set up these services in these memory clinics where we haven't been able to offer this kind of biomarker testing so far. But also what's the potential benefit in terms of being more accurate in your diagnosis? And what's the health economic benefit? So is this something that we could afford within the NHS to roll out further? So a new project, really exciting, I think, and we can keep you posted over time as to how that goes. Another piece of research that we're involved in is this thing called pre-Mastodon AD, complicated title here, but it's basically a project that's looking at setting up what's called a platform trial. So this is to set up a multi-arm, multi-stage platform so that you can compare treatments. One of the concerns with clinical trials is that every time we do a new clinical trial, you have to recruit a new group of people to it. And that includes people, if you have a randomized controlled trial, who have the drug and people who have placebo. So by developing a platform, you could compare drugs in a live way. It's not about doing one trial and then another trial. You can actually compare different drugs at the same time. So this piece of research will look at building the foundation to have a platform to do that, particularly looking at repurposed drugs. So drugs that are already out there that could be used for Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's dementia. We've got 1 year's worth of funding, and we will establish some patient and public involvement as part of that and identify the first 3 drugs and set the outcome measures. And this will be recruited through our network of sites. And then again, this is a busy slide, but I'm just going to explain a little bit of what it focuses on. We're working with the Global Alzheimer's Platform in the US to bring something called BioHermes 2 to the UK. This is a multimodal study, so it's going to look at it's going to recruit 1,000 participants across 30 sites across the EU and the US. And these are the kind of assessments that will be involved. So medical history and cognition, but also blood biomarkers, genotyping, and also amyloid and tau PET. So quite an intensive trial, but it's looking again at what's the validity of things like blood biomarkers, because ultimately not enough people will ever have access to things like PET scan. The other important thing about this trial is that it's aiming to recruit 30% from underrepresented groups. I've mentioned at the start why that's so important. And that all these subjects will then be available for fast recruitment into treatment trials. The other thing that we're working with the Global Alzheimer's Platform is potentially a protocol that will pre-screen people for trials. So pre-screen for late phase 3 trials coming through in the next year or two. So lots going on. And then finally, in terms of what we've been doing so far, we've been establishing a clinical registry across 9 of our sites where we can gather data around dementia diagnosis, risk factors like cardiovascular risk factors and ApoE status. And we're now looking at how we can expand that protocol into primary care via the networks I've mentioned. And one of the things on our agenda for the next year is how can we link this with NHS data, so that obviously if we identify people within our registry and ask people to sign up, it's only going to be of value for recruitment if we can have some live data linkage, so we understand if their memory is getting worse or they're developing other more medical conditions. We're also, as I mentioned at the start, wanting to look beyond the UK. So DP UK has similar infrastructure in Australia and Korea. And I've mentioned about INRAD, we're working with them to look at how we can align our registry with what they're doing internationally. One of the great bonuses of working in Dementias Platform UK is that it supports a lot of ongoing studies, some of which I've already mentioned. And the next thing I'm going to come on to is to talk about our blood biomarker project that we're about to start. What's really exciting is that people who sign up for this registry, we will be able to align their data if they have been in some of our other studies, because we asked them explicitly if they would mind if we do that. So we have a study running at the moment. Some of you as sites may be involved in this, called FAST, which is looking to recruit now 2,000 people. And involves a really simple protocol, so a blood test to look at blood biomarkers for dementia, and also an online cognitive test. And then I'm going to come on and talk to you about the kind of next project along from that called Readout. And we're working with the On Fire network, which is a frontotemporal dementia network, already doing some pre-screening in that group to align their data. I've talked about the CSF project, and we're working with Tim Rittman in Cambridge, who's running the Cumin MC project, and looking at the utility of NHS scans and looking again at how we can align that. And then there are a few other projects looking at much more novel biomarkers that, again, we can align with the registry. So a lot of potential to bring multiple data streams together, which is really exciting. So I'm now going to come on to the really exciting bit that we are working on, or will be starting very shortly, which is our new blood biomarker project. We were given the funding to do this through the AR UK Blood Biomarker Challenge. They've actually gone and funded 2 projects. So there is ours, and there is another project called ADAPT that's running out of University College London. But our project is called Readout, Real World Dementia Outcomes Project, and I'm co-leading this together with Ivan Koichov and James Rowe. We pulled together this protocol because we felt that there is a lot of data around how beneficial blood biomarkers for dementia could be now. And there's actually a lot of data that suggests they are at the point now where we could be using them clinically. And in some countries, they are available clinically or available to the public. But there's still a lot of missing data. So we are still unclear, to be honest, whether blood biomarkers are ready to be used in the real world. And the reason for that is that most of the research that's been done on them to date is, as I mentioned at the start, in particular populations. So we lack a lot of data for people in certain ethnic groups, in the very elderly, in people who have medical comorbidities, so other medical conditions like renal disease, which we know could affect the threshold that you need to use, the cutoff point you need to use in these biomarkers. The other thing we lack some information on is whether these biomarkers are useful for different things. So are they useful for helping to make a diagnosis? Are they useful for giving somebody a prognosis about how quickly their disease may progress or not? How useful are they for tracking response to treatments? So there's still a lot of unknown questions around that. And as I've said, we lack a lot of information in certain groups and also delivery methods. So there's a lot of research now looking at whether we can deliver blood biomarkers through things like a blood spot test that you could get through the post. But what we don't know is whether those tests are as accurate as a regular blood test. So we need to look at that. And then really finally, we need to think about how we're going to share these results. You may have seen all the publicity about this project and the other project a week or so ago that was in the news. And I think what a lot of the media focused on was that this means we could do a blood test and diagnose dementia. And it's certainly not going to be as simple as that, certainly not at this point. What we're talking about is a blood test that would help clinicians make the diagnosis more accurately. At this point, certainly, we're not talking about replacing those other assessments that you do when you go to a memory clinic with a simple blood test. But what we do want to think about is how do we communicate the results? So how do you communicate levels of risk? These are likely not to be tests where you just get a yes or no answer. Sometimes you will, but sometimes it's going to be harder to interpret than that. So how do we in our memory clinics have those conversations? And how can we scale these up across the NHS? So if we get all of this data and we prove that they're useful for making diagnoses or prognoses, how can we roll these out so everybody can benefit from them? So what our project will do is address some of these. So it has a health economic aspect to look at the cost impact for the NHS. Our project is looking at Alzheimer's disease dementia and non-AD dementias. The University College London project is purely focused on Alzheimer's. And we're going to be looking at people from a range of groups so that we can understand where these cutoffs need to be, and working really closely with patient and public involvement groups as to how we interpret these results. And as I mentioned, we've got some sub-studies that will look at things like postal blood tests. What happens if there's a processing delay? Somebody takes your blood test and then it has to sit there for a couple of hours. So again, this is all about how do we understand these things can be rolled out as efficiently as possible in the real world. This map really demonstrates not only where our sites are. This was the original map where our sites were when we made the application for the funding for this, but we've also managed to partner already with 14 integrated care boards across the UK So they're keen to work with us right at the start to understand what data do we need to prove if these blood tests not only are useful clinically, but can the NHS afford them? And the other thing we've done is work with some industry partners, because for this project, we will be sending all of the blood samples for analysis to University College London. But if we are going to develop a program that allows us to roll out these blood tests across the UK, obviously that's not going to be something we can continue. We need to be establishing the ability to do these assays in more than just one site. So by working with industry partners, we're looking at how we can do that as effectively as possible. So just to give you a little bit more meat about what this project will do, we've already developed a patient and public involvement and engagement group. They were really key in helping us design our submission for funding. And we're going to pull in some additional people from other existing diverse PPI groups across the UK. So we really get a large group of people commenting on, does this proposal work? And particularly that bit about how we relay the results of these tests. And this is just a nice quote from somebody in that panel who just said, we think that this could be a great opportunity to use blood biomarkers to get a more accurate diagnosis. We do really need to think about how we're going to work with underserved groups and underrepresented communities, not only in how we relay the results of these tests, but how do we engage people? How do we recruit them? How do we understand if this is something they think is going to be useful in their local memory clinics? And I've already talked a little bit about the false positives and negatives in terms of the fact that these results will probably not be a clear yes or no. There will be a line which we draw where we say, well, your risk is probably this at this point, and it's this at this point. So where do you draw that line? And if you get a negative result, for instance, when do you get another test? So we're going to be working with that group to define some of these points as well. And in terms of our recruitment, we have committed to recruit 30% of our sample from people in underrepresented groups. So 20% from ethnically diverse groups, so with a strong emphasis on people in South Asian and Black populations, and 10% for people who have other medical comorbidities, so things like renal disease. And then on top of that, we're going to recruit 10% of our sample from what we've called not engaged. So this is because we're mindful that not everybody who comes to a memory clinic or should come to a memory clinic does. And then, as I've mentioned, actually, even if they do come through a memory clinic, they don't stay there for very long. And my sense is that over the next few years, the types of people we see being referred to memory clinics will change quite drastically. I think as soon as we have new drugs licensed, a lot more people will be going to their GP and wanting a referral. And we're going to have to think how we manage that, but we're also going to have to think, as I said, what do people want? Do they want to know about their risk early on, knowing that drugs may help? I think we have to work with that group really actively. And we're using some of the procedures that the Global Alzheimer's Platform in the US has used to recruit really effectively. They've managed to increase recruitment to their trials in underrepresented groups from about 5% to about 25%. By using some of these routes, so things like research buses in local sites. So we've budgeted to include 3 research buses to be able to make sure that this protocol is something that people can get involved in really easily. The big questions we'll have in our project is, what are the best biomarkers to diagnose dementia? And as I said, that includes the big questions like, is there Alzheimer's disease, but are there other pathologies? But also around prognosis. So is that individual's progression likely to be rapid or slow? And the key difference in our project, apart from that and the other project that's being funded at UCL, is that we are looking at a range of biomarkers. So we will look at probably the most promising blood biomarker at the moment, which is p-tau217. So it could be, ultimately, we will say just one biomarker is enough. And that would be similar to when we look at blood sugar in people who are potentially diabetic. But I think what's much more likely is we'll be looking for a panel of biomarkers. And this is similar to when we're looking at a lipids profile, for instance, of somebody at risk of heart disease. It could also be that we need a small group of biomarkers that are combined with clinical information. So maybe something like age and comorbidity. And this would be similar to stroke risk and how we assess that. Or it could be that we have to do some really kind of fancy multivariate analyses and come up with a panel combined with things like demographics and an AI algorithm. We don't know. This is what this project will hopefully address. So there's two parts to it. The first part will run for the first 3 years of the study, and we'll recruit about 3,000 people into this study with a really simple protocol, which will basically be a blood test and a cognitive test. So in order for us to be able to recruit as many people as possible, we're splitting the blood biomarkers that we'll put in the panel a bit broadly into 3 groups, and the focus for us will be on the first 2. Tier 1 are blood biomarkers like p-tau217, where there's already a really good amount of evidence and they may be clinically available in some countries. And tier 2 is where the blood biomarkers have a good amount of research evidence, but we're still lacking some data. Tier 3 is the much more exploratory end, and that isn't being funded in this project, but through some of our industry partners, we hope to be able to do some work in those too. And basically, we will put these into a panel of biomarkers and we'll look at how much they're able to predict if you do have a disease or you don't have a disease, how sensitive and specific they are. And we'll define those thresholds I talked about with input from our public and patient involvement group and our ICBs, the commissioners. And because we recognize that there will be different bits of information that we will have on people in this study, there are different ways that we can validate their clinical diagnosis. And as I said, we've also got some sub-studies that will look at things like processing delays. And if we send these blood tests out through the post, how reliable are those results? But at the end of the 3 years, if not before, we will come up with a panel of biomarkers, which will then, and I'm going to go on to the next slide actually, feed into a randomized controlled trial. And in this, we will look at what is the clinical benefit of using these blood biomarkers in the real world. People will be randomized to an arm where they're either disclose their biomarker status or they're not, and there'll be about 400 people in each arm. And the main outcome measure will be whether that person's quality of life improves or not. Now, we recognize that can be quite hard to define and quite hard to measure, particularly over a short period. So we're looking at some other secondary outcomes, which will include things like the quality of life of their carer, if they have a carer, how acceptable having a blood test is to them. Have they developed any other problems like anxiety or depression as a result of having that blood test, or have they improved? And what's the healthcare usage that they've had since? So are they seeing their GP more because they're more worried? Or actually, do they feel more reassured because they've got a clearer diagnosis? So they're not coming as much to see other services. And then the final bit of the project, as I mentioned, is a health economic analysis. So this is really looking at whether if we incorporate blood biomarkers into clinical care, will they give value and are they affordable? So in order to establish if they give value, we'll look at this thing called quality adjusted life years, which is the thing that NICE uses to establish whether something is suitable to fund or not in the NHS. We put those together with information around wider costs. So we'll be sending out questionnaires to participants in both arms of the study, the observational study and the RCT, to say, are you incurring other costs at the moment? You know, are you needing support at home? You know, things like an alarm if you fall. Is your carer needing to take time off work? Those types of wider costs. We put all of that into a model, and we'll be again using our commissioners to help design that, to work out a value for establishing these blood biomarkers. And then what we will do is look at the likely size of the population that could need blood biomarkers over the next 5 years and work out if we can afford them in the NHS. So overall, what this study will hopefully provide is, by using our existing network of sites, we're going to be able to get off the ground really quickly, and we're going to be able to recruit quite diverse populations in the real world. We've already got a lot of buy-in from PPIE groups, which I'm really pleased about, and I'm really excited that we've got 14 ICBs involved, because what's been different for me compared to maybe a few years ago is when I've talked to commissioners in the past, they've been very worried about the costs of any changes and any research studies. I think they are realizing that the potential of being able to use a blood test to give somebody a more accurate diagnosis is really something that we could roll out without a huge additional cost. And for me, this is partly about how we can allow people to get new drugs when they come online. But it's more than that. I think when I see patients in clinic now, they want to know more about their diagnosis. Not everybody does. Some people say, I'd rather not have information ahead of time. That's fine. That's their choice. But for lots of people, I think they want more information now. So having our commissioners on board early is great. We're building a lot of other existing studies, as I said, to validate these blood biomarkers. And we're going to collaborate with the other group at UCL so that we have complementary outputs, because as I mentioned, they are just looking at Alzheimer's disease and they're only looking at p-tau217 as a biomarker. I just want to emphasize that I'm part of a really large team that's going to be delivering this project, and I want to kind of emphasize how important their input has been to this. And so we're entering a point, I think, that's really exciting for DP UK and the trial delivery framework. We're going to be starting readout very shortly. So if anybody on this call wants to know more, do get in touch with me. We're going to look now at how we can align some of our registry work and biomarker work in CSF and blood to develop some kind of level of pre-screening of people for trials, with an emphasis on late phase trials, because as I've mentioned, things like the DTRC Trials Network has a focus on early phase trials. We want to be able to mentor and support sites that want to get more involved in research. And I think by the resource we have through some of our trials and projects that I've mentioned, we can do that. And hopefully, inadvertently, it's not one of our main aims, but we will be able to support the changes in UK memory clinic service delivery that I think will happen over the next couple of years through things like NHS England as we see new drugs. I think we have the opportunity in DP UK to use our data portal to make sure we have a level of data linkage that means we can really understand the impact of these biomarkers and drugs, but also if people want to take part in trials, we can kind of keep track of them over a period of time and work out if they would still be eligible. And then I think we need to work internationally with our partners and build wider international structure to do trials as efficiently as possible. And all of this will go into our renewal plans. We'll hopefully be going for renewal of DP UK at the end of next year and hope we can continue this great work. So I'm going to stop there and open for any questions.